All right. Well, let's start today's session. Everyone, thank you for joining us today and welcome to Intro to Governance. We're really excited to host this crash course in what we're calling the Principles of Good Governance for Nonprofits and Charities. And this is part of our Integral Intro series where we give overviews of the key areas of nonprofit management that we specialize in. My name is Liz Tang, and I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the education coordinator for Integral.org. And I'll be around hosting and monitoring the chat and any sort of tech support. So without further ado, we'll advance the slides onto our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subject to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland, and we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. And at Integral.org, we're very grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. This is our facilitator. This is Mike Grogan. This is President and CEO of Integral.org. And from board governance to strategy development and sustainability planning, Mike has over 30 years of experience where he is recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of organizations. So with that, take it away, Mike.
Well, thank you, Liz, and hello to all of you. Very glad to have you join us today. I'm having some technology problems, so I can't actually see anybody who's on the call. I can see my screen. I can see a blank monitor in front of me, so I'm going to speak to this void somehow. And Liz assures me that I look fine. My hair is not all mussed up, which I was quite worried about, not seeing myself, but I'm sure we shall prevail. So great to have you join us today. I really enjoy working on governance issues. It's one of the pillars of our work at Integral.org. So Integral.org is a charity and nonprofit, and our job is to help other charities and nonprofits do whatever you do better. So governance is one of those pieces, a lot of planning work. We're legal service providers. We do law work for legal work for nonprofits, and now moving into leadership development. So always a privilege to work with folks, and your questions, your insights, your thoughts are certainly a part of this. So please do, as Liz says, throw them out in the mix, throw up your hand or throw a comment in the chat, and we can go from there. Today, we're going to talk through a few different parts of governance. We're going to talk kind of the basics of governance. What is kind of governance 101? What do we in Alberta think in terms of nonprofits? What are the sort of those foundational pieces of governance, which I think every organization does need to have in place? We'll talk about roles and responsibilities of the board, maybe the role between staff and board, those kind of things. We're going to talk about some of the common issues. I think that COVID has been tough on boards. So we'll talk about what we're seeing and what we see out there as sort of those global issues on boards right now. Then we move into a bit different kind of tone towards the end, and it's maybe an evolving nature of governance, and that is we move on that from the basic governance pieces to 2 different theories, and these are all really theories in many ways. There's some things that are drawn from the acts and those kind of places, but there are theories of how boards work, and one called governance of leadership, and the one about purpose-driven boards, just to give you a sense of, okay, what's happening now? What are different ways we can use to engage people and to learn about ourselves? And then, as always, in every session we do, we love to leave you with tools and resources, places to go. If those tools and resources don't tend to meet your needs, you got a question, by all means, do reach out afterwards or even during the session here, and we'll see if we can point you in the right direction. So I'm going to start with a quote, and I really like this quote because it sets the tone, I think, for boards and what governance is in the nonprofit world. And this is from Stanford Social Innovation, a wonderful resource for all kinds of things in nonprofit land and governance and social innovation, all kinds of great things. But boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. I mean, that line alone just causes me to pause and to think there's nothing quite like being on a nonprofit board. You're not a family, you're not a team, you're not people who work together in a different context. You are sort of sometimes thrust together with people who have a similar passion for what you might be about, but not quite the same. Just because we're on a board doesn't mean we understand the work of the organization the same way, the role of the board. So you get that sort of unique structure. There's nothing quite like it. And it's curious because it's hard to do good board work. We're going to talk about sort of the theory, but we're going to sort of talk about the reality too of being on a board. That in theory, boards aren't really that complex. I mean, we can sort of lay out some of the basic premises. We'll do that. But in reality, they do get much tougher. So we'll talk about that. Boards have significant power, but only as a collective, since no individual board member can enact anything independently. And that, in a nutshell, is the heart of being a board. You act as a group, this curious structure, which is a team game, that you might have different roles in the board. You may have some different functions that people do as a part of the board, but as an entity, boards are a collective. And so how do you work as a collective? You sort of think back to, doing games with kids when you're younger, or if you have kids, and sort of the three-legged race where you've got to tie legs together and people have to act as a team and figure out where to go. To me, that is a bit of a metaphor for a board. You're connected, you're all trying to go roughly the same direction, but sometimes you're pulling different ways. And so how do we sort of recognize that and deal with that as we can? You sit both atop and outside the organizational structure with a role that is accountable to those outside the organization as well as those within. It is that atop and outside that I think is one of the most powerful parts of being a board. But it's also probably one of the greater challenges. So atop means all the authority, all the responsibility resides in the board. But you're somewhat outside it. For organizations that have staff members or work in that purely policy type of governance role, it's hard to know what's going on. So you're away from the action. So how do you make governance decisions when you're not there day to day and not quite on top of things? So those are the things we'll talk about, how to deal with that, what the different roles are and what you do with that. In a more technical sense, this is what boards do. This is from the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, who are a wonderful resource for all things governance in Canada. Great resources, really kept up to date, really clear. So on their site, we'll provide this at the end, not just on roles of boards, but boards in social enterprise, boards in risk management. They've got some really good tools of things to think about. But from their definition, the board is responsible for all aspects of the organization, including overseeing its operations and holding management accountable for delivering on the mission of the organization. Boards are required to make decisions that are in the organization's best interest. A pretty standard definition, I think. And it's that idea that if you take anything from that definition is that you're responsible for everything, that the power and the authority and the responsibility start and end with the board. Now, boards may delegate some of that away, sometimes internally to different committees, sometimes to staff members, quite often an executive director or a CEO, but it still is a delegated authority. The authority actually lies with, the responsibility authority lie with the board. So that can change as different structures evolve in an organization. One of the things that I think is important as we talk through this, and we'll talk through theories, we'll talk through some best practices, we'll talk through where some of these concepts come from. But there is always a balance, I think, between the governance theory and best practice and the structure and history and style of the board, the reality of the board. So as I say, sometimes the theory is not overly complex, but the reality of being on a board can be very complex. And you may have boards that are so good at practice. They get this, they've got structures, they've got policies, they've got all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and they're still not a very effective board. Conversely, you may have boards that are kind of ragged. They don't have a lot of policies. Their structures all over the place, yet can be very highly impactful. So that balance of what we know from theory or best practice, the reality of being on a board, there can be quite a gulf sometimes. And there are some things you need to have in place. Doesn't matter if your board's loosely structured or really, really well structured. There are some things as a board member, individually and collectively, you do need to have in place. But more importantly, it's the culture of the board and how you work together. There's probably the harder work to do. We won't touch a lot on team building as a board or the culture of a board. We have other sessions that will do that. But recognize that as you go through this and listen to things saying, well, we kind of do that, kind of not. I would say every board has work to do on how they structure themselves, the culture, their practice. It is an ongoing piece of work. It also changes over time. You may have boards that are really rocking it 1 month and some things happen. And all of a sudden you've got work to do. So this is not something you sort of do once and build your board up and set it and forget it. Building highly impactful boards that are compliant, that get their role, that operate in a highly functional way is ongoing work. So that's part of, I think, what gives us our power, but also something that we sometimes tend to ignore in nonprofits is that boards taking care of their own work and making sure that what we do as a board member is actually in line with what we want to do as an organization. So I want to go back to Liz for a second for a quick poll. Liz is going to pull up a poll, and really the question is quite simple. On a scale of 1 to 5, your own experience, how would you rate your understanding of nonprofit governance? Numbers starting to pop in. Seems to be a bit of a range from I am new to absolutely. Oh, there's number 2. I was going to say there's no number 2s, but there is one. Fantastic. Good to see it spread out that way. Can we share that poll, Liz? I think
Yep. And sharing. There we go.
With my limited view of the screen, I'm sure it's up there, but there it is. See that part? Yeah. So great answers. And there's no right or wrong answer. Obviously, there's a poll. Like some people brand new to this, great. We'll sort of cover some things for you. Some folks really quite, you should be teaching this thing. Why am I here? If you're number 5, perfect. I think, this is something, again, I work for a board, I'm on a board, I teach governance. We work with boards directly all the time to come in and help individual organizations. And it's always something for us to learn. So I think it's an ongoing piece of knowledge and understanding we need to build up. So whatever you have here, your experience, certainly bring your questions, bring your insights, bring your rebuttals. I mean, if it's all those kind of things. So I hope there's something for everybody in this. I hope that as we go through this, no matter where you are in your own experience, there's a piece here you can take away that enhances your experience of a board member. We're going to start with some basic roles and responsibilities. What does it mean to be on a board? And what are boards? What do we really do in a board? So we'll go through some basics. We'll give you some more information at the end, lots more where this comes from. This is really just, I think, the really sort of basic best practices. So in a nutshell, when we talk about the board being a collective and what the board does, there's a few things that sort of fit into that best practice, that idea of, okay, well, what are some of the concepts we build board governance around? And one of it is that you focus on the whole organization, that boards being responsible to the entire organization and being the ultimate authority in an organization, even if they have delegated some of that away, need to understand and focus on the whole organization. So sometimes you'll get people joining boards and saying, well, I'm an accountant and I'm here to understand the financials. I'll make sure the budgets are fine, your audit goes well, that you've got the financial controls in place. And absolutely, you bring your experience, bring your skill set, especially if that is a role you've been assigned in the board, an officer's role, perhaps a treasurer in that case. But it doesn't mean that as an accountant that you can ignore everything else, that the programmatic side, the human resource side, the funding side, all the other pieces, that the board focuses the entire organization, not just pieces of it that are of interest to you or fall within your background or your experience level. So boards focus on the whole organization. That you work together as a whole and speak with one voice. Really important. It's that idea of acting as a collective, and that you can only act as a collective. So how do we work together and speak with one voice? And it is around the boardroom table, when you're behind closed doors, you may have all kinds of dissenting opinions. You're all over the place saying, or go this way or that way. When you come out of that boardroom, though, there is one voice. There is one direction you're setting. It's not messages that say, well, part of the board thinks this and part of the board thinks that, and I think this. That's not what a board does. And that's the hard part. We talk about this unique structure and this curious structure as a board. How do you come up with some idea of consensus where all voices are heard internally, but there's an external voice that is coherent for the external group, for the CEO, perhaps, for the staff, for other stakeholders that give that sense of that we are aligned and working as a collective. Board approved policy and monitor impact. And we talk about how boards work. And it changes a bit if you're a board that is smaller, you have no staff perhaps, and you're doing work where you're both governing the organization, that oversight function, and you're doing the work, the implementation, the management of the organization. But you need to separate those roles out. So boards work through policy. And policy can be complex, it can be quite simple, but it's how we say what we will do. And making it clear and making it ensure that when the next group of people join the board continues, but individuals pop in and out of it, that they understand that this is the direction of the board. This is how we enact what we do. This is how we speak. In many ways, it's through policy. And there's other ways for boards to speak, but one of the big ways is through policy. Boards hire and supervise only one employee. Again, a bit of a caveat there. If you don't have staff, you may not have it. But if you are a board that has an executive director, that senior staff model, which many organizations do, you have one employee. The organization may have many employees, hundreds, thousands of employees. The board has one. And that is designed to say you have a single employee that you relate to who does the management piece, who takes care of the implementation. So the board's not talking to the day-to-day staff members. You may talk to them and have connection with them. It's not like there's hands off, but you have one employee. So you're not directing the staff. That's coming through your one employee. So picture like an hourglass where you have the board up here, narrows down to one employee, and then back out again. And that's, I think, really important for clarity of role, certainly for avoiding conflicts, mixed messaging, some of the power dynamics might go with that, the board being the responsible overall authority, saying we're going to give some directions to staff that maybe the CEO or executive director doesn't know about. That's a bit of a challenging situation. So that idea of boards having one employee is really important. Again, understanding the difference between governance and management. The boards govern, and there's a management function carried out by staff or board members or volunteers acting in different capacity. So we'll walk through the levels of that as we go through this. As an individual director, though, so that was boards as a whole, was some of the best practices, some of the things you need to think about as a board. As an individual director, you've chosen to join a board, you've got this passion for the organization, you understand, okay, I want to help out, I want to do something that helps my community, so being on a board seems like a good fit, and it is a great fit. I think we need more of that. I think it's recruiting people to board is a bit of a challenge these days. But as an individual board, you have two really fundamental duties that you need to sort of think about. And these are two fiduciary duties, and you have two components to this. One is the duty of care, to act with the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise, but exercise in comparable circumstances. There is some subjectivity to that line. So what the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person would act with similar knowledge in comparable circumstances. There's some gray areas there. So what it tends to mean, though, is you need to come prepared. You need to sort of act with that understanding of the organization, the diligence. I read the minutes. I come prepared to meet or to board meetings. I'm not reading the package as the meeting's going on. That I'm taking seriously my duty to know the organization, the environment we work within, the risk to the organization, that I'm here to care for the organization and bringing my best self to that. There's times when the idea that the reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise. So if I'm an accountant on the board, that standard is higher perhaps than if I'm a social worker on the board. So an accountant is going to have a different level of knowledge and expertise than the social worker on financial matters. The social worker may have far more on programmatic matters, client issues, privacy issues, perhaps, those types of things. It doesn't mean, though, that as a social worker, I have no say in the financial side of things. We will focus on the whole organization. But the level that I'm held to in terms of a standard, and there's no standard in the sense of that there's a grid to sort of follow, but the financial person, the accountant, has a higher level of expertise and experience, and is therefore needs to bring that level of expertise and experience. You can't say, well, I'm an accountant, I know everything about accounting, but I didn't sort of bring that best to the board. So you bring that level of experience and expertise that you have as an individual. Second part is duty of loyalty, to act with honesty and good faith in the best interest of the organization. So this includes things like conflict of interest, that you are not bringing issues to the table or engaging in discussions where you're conflicted. There's times when board members can have a conflict of interest. Sometimes they may be at the level where they're so serious you need to step off the board. But quite often there are areas where you just need to declare that, saying, listen, there's an issue here in a hiring piece, or perhaps a contract we want to get into, or a funding arrangement, and you have some relationship that says, I can't quite make that objective decision. I need to step back from that. I need to recuse myself from conversations and decisions on that. So quite often you can handle that with just sort of declarations and some processes, perhaps some policy work to make sure that doesn't happen for a board. Other things that sort of fall into that duty of loyalty is that idea that the best interests of the entire organization. So again, not just part of it. I'm not perhaps just here to, protect one program that's near and dear to my heart, or I'm a big fan of the CEO and I'm just here to make sure the CEO doesn't lose their job. Those aren't necessarily the organizational best interests. We can sometimes twist ourselves into not making that appear so. But that idea that you're here to focus on the whole, to do what's best for the organization, but not at the expense of sort of individual parts of the organization or facets of the organization. Where does this come from? And you do have some places where your authority as a board member comes from. It's not just sort of made up and sort of out there in the ether, it does come, that fiduciary duty comes from a couple of places. So one is the act, the legislation that you're formed under. And in Alberta, largely that will be the Societies Act. About 3/4 of the nonprofits in Alberta, about 30,000 nonprofits, give or take, in Alberta right now, which is a lot of nonprofits. We tend to crank out quite a few. But you have some authority given to you from the Act. And you don't need to go to the Act and read this, but it is that the Act gives you some authorities. So the Societies Act being a big one, the Companies Act, Part 9, other acts, sometimes agriculture. There's about 6 or 8, I think, acts that can form a type of nonprofit out there. But you're given some authority in that. And that gives you both the responsibility, but the latitude to work. It provides you some liability protection along the way, too. So the Act gives you that. Then you have objects. So you're thinking this narrowing down. The Act gives you a big piece, your objects. This is about you, why you're formed. As a nonprofit, you were set up to do certain things, and you should do those things. Those are the things. You should be doing a whole bunch of other things. You've been given some authority and some responsibility to act on behalf of community according to your objects. If you go on to become a charity, so 30,000 nonprofits, maybe 9,000 charities in this province, charities have charitable purposes aligned with your objects somewhat. We're a little more restrictive. As a charity, you can only do things that are in line with your charitable purposes. So you can't just be most of the stuff you do. Charities are far more rigid on that kind of stuff. And then from that, you have bylaws and policies. Bylaws tell you how the organization will be governed. So who can become a member, how members are put in place, how the board is appointed or elected, things like minutes and office and all those kind of things. It's kind of those basic rules of the road for being a nonprofit. And the policies are really what you do as a board. How are we going to get things done? How are we going to interact with our staff? What is the code of conduct we have for our board members? So it's a broad funnel that sort of walks you down from the big stuff to the little stuff, and it gives you the laneways to work within. So we talk about best practices. These are some pretty solid ones, and they can be really complex and really involved. Certainly for some organizations have very big bylaws, sort of manuals that sort of like work your way through. But we talk about a practice and the theory. This is really the heart and soul of practice and theory for your organization, what act you're under, what objects you have, what you're supposed to do and govern yourself in terms of bylaws, and then how you'll act as a board. So those are the best practices you need to think about. Probably not super complex a lot of times, but the reality can be a little messier than that. Just a bit of a note too. There's a question that comes up sometimes. This is from Pacific Legal Education in BC. The concepts are largely the same in terms of what we think about officers and directors. So directors and officers are different. Sometimes they can be blended together, and quite often you'll have an officer who is a director, by most cases. But a director is a person in charge of managing, overseeing the activities and internal affairs of a nonprofit, elected according to the bylaws or articles, depending on the act you're under. So these are the governors. When you talk about who's in the board, directors, the governors are directors. That's who they are. Officers oftentimes are directors, but not always. So in INTEGRAL, we're a charity nonprofit. We have officers who are not a part of the board. So they help the board execute. They're there to serve the board in their governance functions. So very specific duties. So sometimes the duties are things like the president or vice president, which oversee the work of the board, don't necessarily come with any more authority, usually. Secretary, making sure the board minutes and the board filings are up to date and those types of things, and treasurer overseeing the financial systems. So quite often, the same people. You may have a board director who is your treasurer. We have that. We also have a secretary in INTEGRAL who is not a board member. So directors govern, officers execute on behalf of the board. So not on the management side of the organization, for the board is kind of the basic premise of that. Just in terms of what makes an effective board, what sort of gets you thinking about a board that, how do we do good work? So the number one, I think, is understanding good governance, and which includes your own continuity, developing new board members, but doing this kind of stuff, making sure that as a board, individually and collectively, we understand what governance is. And I think this is often lost for boards. We oftentimes leave this to the background. There's lots to do. We tend to focus on the operations, the financial side, maybe some planning pieces, problem solving, getting updates on operations. But to take the time to understand what governance is, some of the stuff we're learning today, but to do that collectively. And we've done work on boards where we come into individual organizations and do that version of this session. And it doesn't matter if you're a small grassroots organization or a giant funding body. To attend to this on a regular basis is really important, because as the board members change up, you get different views in the board, you get different situations with staff or different external environments. It's really good to go back to the basics and say, what does this mean for us? What does it mean to do these things like be a board that speaks with one voice, or what does it mean for us to supervise that CEO or the executive director? It does change over time. So I'm not saying it's every year, but I think that on a regular basis, you got to attend to your own governance, which is really important. And we do that when people come on boards, we sort of put them on and maybe do a bit of that work. I suggest it probably is an under-resourced and under-supported area of this governance world that we live within. Boards have the focus of ensuring the long-term sustainability. This is, again, starting to pull back that idea. We're not here to manage and do the day-to-day. You may do some of that work, but you're wearing a different hat when you do that. But boards have that longer-term vision, and some of the pieces we'll get to at the end of this session, I think, really speak well to that, to say, how do we sort of lift our eyes from the fiduciary parts of the organization, which I think we're really good at, to what are those bigger pieces about the longer vision we're trying to fulfill, what change we want to make. Hire, guide, and direct and evaluate the senior executive. Okay, you got one employee, you got a few pieces you got to do. You are an employer. So how do you make sure you've hired the right person? You're giving them support, you're evaluating them, all those kind of good things. Making sure that you do have policies, and you should have some policies. They're up to date and they're effective. So a lot of times you'll see this in any part of a nonprofit. Yeah, we got a governance manual. Haven't seen it for 3 or 4 years, but I'm sure it's fine. Yeah, probably not fine. So the idea of how do you make sure they're updated, relevant terminology as things change, and even then starting to put out new policies in areas that perhaps 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago you're not dealing with. Diversity and equity inclusion stuff probably wasn't included in a lot of policy manuals 5 years ago. Now I think it's a pretty common part of what we're seeing in policy manuals. And the last place is that I think that board members play a really good role, that you're ambassadors for the organization. You are a volunteer who is there giving your time. You've got lots of choices where you can spend your time, but you are giving of yourself to be a part of this organization. And you can speak about the organization in ways that are really powerful, in ways that staff people can't. Sometimes you're doing donor relations, sometimes in other fundraising pieces, certainly government relations and their piece of this, where you're coming in as a community member, and that carries a lot of weight. The idea that I'm here as a member of community working for this organization, I think it's really important. You're not a paid staff person. You're not somebody who's, got a vested interest in making sure the organization works for their ways. Not saying that staff people are there just for their own sake, but board members have that power and that ability that other folks do not have. One of the things we're seeing in boards right now, and as I say, I think it's been tough on boards for COVID, and I think coming out of it, we're seeing hopefully some signs of life here. But the early days of COVID, and not that boards were all rocking it before, I think boards are always tough. But COVID was a situation that we worked, got very reactive really quickly. That organizations had to adapt programming and operational models, staffing, way you worked, and it became very focused on the operations and the program stuff, which tends to put boards into the back seat a bit there, saying you're not front and center. So what did boards do? Well, you started meeting online. Probably engagement was down. Sometimes recruitment's down because it's tough to recruit when people you never see. But so it's been tough on us. And some of the things we're seeing, lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities in the activities of individual board members, the board as a whole. Again, this is something that every board probably needs to understand on a regular basis. But, what do I do as a board member? I've joined this board, but I'm not quite sure how we're supposed to work. And so that is a problem we're seeing. And I think it's very common. Again, it doesn't matter if you're big or small, really well established or brand new, that idea of focusing on what is the role of the board and, what do we need to sort of focus on for our board. Poor or fractured working relationships. As we've all gone through stress over the last number of years, I think some of that's playing itself out in organizations, and certainly at the board level. We deal with calls every day from organizations that are struggling with an issue here and there, and we love to do. That's our work, is to listen and to come alongside if we can and help folks. But the idea that it's been all out war in some boards, and I've had a session a couple weeks ago where the executive left after one day of a 2-day session because the fractured relationships are so huge. Another organization where the entire board and executive team quit one night. So it's a lot of stress out there, and it's tough for boards, it's tough for staff teams. Hopefully we're coming out of the worst of it. I think we are, and you're starting to get back to normal-ish ways of being, but there's some wounds along the way. And so as we've all gone through stress, I think organizations are no different. Recruitment and engagement of board members is tough right now. I think volunteerism has been hard again through COVID, but even beyond that, the idea of volunteering and giving on a board is waning. It's not down to nothing. Obviously, there's folks here and there's lots of great board members out there, but volunteerism is dropping off. And it's the long-term volunteering, and boards tend to be a bit more longer term in their volunteer construct. So we're seeing less and less people wanting to serve on a board, being there for the longer term. So to get people on the board, then figure out how to use them, how to use their skills in the best possible way on the board is always a bit of a struggle. Getting the work done, how you organize the work of the board, meetings, terms of reference. Sometimes these are well established, sometimes they get a little dated, sometimes they're not there at all. So, and these are, when we talk about structuring the work of the board, this is something that should change over time. As the organization grows, as you morph from different things, the structure you might need on a board will change. I was on a board once that I joined it, and there's like 10, 12 people on this board, and I think they had 14 committees. And you need to have a minimum of 2 or 3 members on a committee, board members. You start doing the math in your head saying, going to be a lot of committees on this board. So we managed to get them down to 5 or 6, I think. So it should change over time. The structure you put in place, the rules, the terms of reference, all that kind of stuff should adapt as the organization changes. And organizations are not a static body. You might have your objects and think like nothing changes, but organizations do change and grow and morph over time. So it is something we need to pay attention to. And then I think one of the bigger challenges is, and this will lead to our next section, is the engaging and utilizing the skills and expertise of board members in an appropriate manner. It's one of those things where we get on a board and think, well, I'm not quite sure what to do. I know I got to oversee stuff, and I come to board meetings and I read reports and I give my insight on my wisdom on different things, and other people do too. But is that what I need to do as a board member? If I'm not supposed to be running the show, I'm not supposed to be getting into day-to-day operations, I'm supposed to let the managers manage. So then what do I really do? And it has to be more than just reading a board report and showing up at AGM. There are other things to do. So how do we figure out what that is? And we'll get into that piece as we wind through this presentation. I want to talk quickly about board and staff relations, because I think this is an area where, it's hard to get this right. Again, this is a balancing act. This is, it's hard to, this is a relationship, and relationships need work, and you need to focus on this. And how do you have this sort of relationship between a board, which is a collective, and staff, which in the case of the board model we're using here is one person. So how do you get that relationship right? So you don't have boards that overreach and sort of move into operational issues. You don't have CEOs that overreach and sort of keep the board off to the side, so they're kind of neutered in some ways. So that relationship is an ongoing piece, and it'll shift as boards sort of go through their general growth and for rebuilding times. So you'll have to rebuild that relationship continuously. But just in terms of roles, this is the way we structure it. This is Alberta Board Development, their common definition of how these roles play out. Governors, boards of directors, they set the tone through strategic direction and policy development. Again, that oversight role. You're the responsible group. You're the ones over top of things. You enact through policy, strategies, those types of things. Managers, the senior executive, quite commonly called an executive director, a chief executive officer. Sometimes you'll have, general manager, perhaps. Some arts organization might have an artistic director and a business manager. Sometimes you get 2 senior staff people, but usually just one. And their job is to interpret and supervise the board policies. So boards set policy, managers implement policy. You're doing the day-to-day operations, allocating resources within policy, within guidelines, what might be. You're getting stuff done. You're managing their work. You're taking those broad directions, saying, we're going to get it done as a manager. And then who does the work? Well, it's all work, I get that. But the idea of implementation or staff, maybe volunteers, day-to-day operations. So again, you may have board members who are involved as volunteers. You may have board members, if you have no staff, that are governing the organization, doing all those great governance things, and are out there, doing program work, doing fundraising work. Recognize when you're doing that program work or that fundraising work, whatever it is, you're not there as a board member. Yes, you're still a board member, but you're working in a different capacity. You're working as a volunteer in that sense. You can have both those roles, but it's important that people understand that. Especially if you're a board member who's sort of working alongside perhaps staff members, that you're there to help them out, not there to oversee their work. So those clarity of roles is really important. It gets murky. I get that sometimes. It's hard to know, where I'm at with things, but it's good for people to know that I'm not just here to engage as a board member if I'm doing some other programmatic work. The CEO, just to clarify their role, executing the strategies and managing the operations. You're reporting regularly to the board. How do we have boards that can make decisions and do things without information? So that reporting function is really, really important. If I'm going to be a board member, I need to know enough to make some decisions, and that comes from the people who are on the ground or managing the organization. Preparing annual budgets, a bit of an asterisk beside that one. You can have boards that do this, and sometimes it's a bit of a shared responsibility. Sometimes the treasurer will do that, again, depending on the size and structure of the organization. But the staff are going to work within that and operationalize that. So again, that distinction supports the development of the board. And this is a big one. So as we talk about boards needing to attend to their own well-being, board governance, board self-governance, we call it sometimes, that the CEO or the executive or the staff are there to support that. It's not to do it for you, though. This is not a staff role. Boards have the responsibility of taking care of their own house. And sometimes you need help to do that, and staff can help do that, but it's a supportive role, not an oversight, not driving that. And then request consultation support from the board members in their individual areas of expertise. And so this goes back to the idea that maybe on a board, maybe you're an accountant, maybe you're a lawyer, whatever role it might be. And sometimes operationally, that there may be an issue for the organization itself saying, I've got an accounting question. I've got a legal question. I've got an HR question. I know there's somebody on my board who has that expertise. I'm going to ask them to give me some guidance, some insight, some direction on what I can do with this specific incident. Now, sometimes that's tricky. Lawyers sometimes have a tough time and are restricted in doing that work. Sometimes they don't. It's up to the board, the individual that way. But what's important about this is not the individual board members sort of reaching down from the board table saying, I see you got some problems in HR. I'm here to correct them for you. Boards only work collectively, so that doesn't work that way. But it's driven the other way, where it's driven from the executive to the board saying, you've got some expertise. I could use some help. Can I get some guidance on this? So that requesting consultation and support when you need it. So again, it goes back to that relationship and understanding both who's on your board and what role they play in terms of working with the executive director or CEO. So just in terms of some of the differences, what we see between boards and staff, board act only as a group, or the staff act individually. So we're not collective staff. You've got one. The board is a continuous entity. The board, there's not the last board, the next board. There is a board. It is there until the organization is not there. Whereas staff, we're temporary. We're here at the will of the board, and I could be gone tomorrow. Hoping not, but one never knows. The boards are elected or appointed. Usually, staff are employer contracted. The boards are volunteers. You're here to give your time voluntarily. Where staff are generally paid to be here. The board has an orientation towards the future, where the staff maybe focus more on day to day. I think there is some balance in that. We can sort of probably extract a little more nuance from. Board assigns authority. Again, you have all the authority. If you're going to give it away, it's got to be assigned to somebody, usually in a very clear and really mutually understood way. But the staff receive that authority to do the work they do. Staff can't do things without receiving some authority from the board. Board sets policy, the staff operate within that. The boards are often lay people. It doesn't mean you don't have expertise, and you may have even expertise in the area that the nonprofit works within. But staff are generally professional nonprofit staff. And that's a trend that probably over the last 20 or maybe more than that, 30 years or so, the professionalization of the nonprofit sector, both in terms of individual roles. You certainly see that in fundraising and social work roles, but even in nonprofit management from, what might have been, well-intended, but maybe not overly sort of effective sometimes managers to being, this is a discipline. This is something that people spend their careers doing. So you do have a bit of a difference that way. Again, it's not saying you don't have expertise of the board, your own profession, but in terms of managing the nonprofit, that's why we have staff. Any questions, Liz? I'm seeing chat here, but I don't.
We have one question.
Yeah.
So in the absence of an executive director, are you able to create an executive leadership team made up of board members? Are there any sort of best practices to support this model? I interpreted this as, while you're transitioning to a new ED, how would that work?
Yeah, sometimes you can do it a few different ways. I mean, if it's a transition and your model was as a board and then the executive director, sometimes you can appoint an interim person. Sometimes that can be a person on the board. They maybe take a leave from the board, so they're not acting as a board and a staff person. Sometimes it's somebody outside the organization that can do that. But other times it can be a committee of the board that's going to oversee some of those operational things. And we sort of talk about the idea of boards governing and staff, operating, and it's not necessarily a hierarchy like that, but and the two shall never meet. That's not true. The distance between those two kind of come and go over time. So as an executive director leaves, the board's going to draw closer into operations, and whether you have somebody filling the role or not, you do kind of get that transition part where the board becomes a little more operational, a little more into management, while the new executive director comes on. Maybe you keep that while they're on board, and then they start to separate out again. So it's not lanes that are super clearly defined all the time. They'll change, the organization grows or goes through different transition periods, but certainly an interim staff person, a committee of the board. But again, it's the roles need to be clear, and everything we talk about problems on boards. It's role clarity all the time. If that's clear and the staff understand it, the rest of the board understands it, the board in this case, if there is this model of creating a committee to be the executive committee, the executing committee at the time, which is different than an executive committee perhaps during transitions, that it's clearly defined. The board understands that role, the staff understand that role, your external stakeholders understand that, and then what the limitations and the time frame might be on that. Okay, and then move on. Nope, good. Thank you. Wow, that's great. Just to move on here, just going to move into two different pieces, and we'll this is the stuff we've just gone through, what I call governance 101, which is really important, and every organization needs that. You need the basics in place, and there's nothing wrong with this stuff. It's really good stuff. It is. And so the next two pieces, I think, build upon. This is not to replace that, but as we have seen people think about boards and the challenges of the boards and the way boards work, there's other ways of doing things. So I'm going to give you two really quick models, and we'll tell you where they come from. And there's certainly some good reading out there on both these pieces that maybe elevate the role of the board into different areas, a little more modern, a little more engaging members in a different way. So the first one's called governance as leadership. And this comes from some work that's about 10 years old now. And it's Chait and Stewart and somebody else. I'll have the reference here in a second. It'll pop up. It'll be on the slide coming up. But it's the idea that governance discussions had focused on fiduciary duties, and governance boards primarily as instruments of accountability rather than agents of change and innovation. So the idea of doing all the fiduciary things, the oversight role, the risk management piece, supervising staff, really important. That's not going anywhere, but maybe a little bit limiting for boards. There's other ways they can engage. So this model incorporates three different, they would call them interconnected modes of responsibility for boards. The first is fiduciary, the stewardship of the organization's assets. And one of the things, I think the stuff we've just talked about probably fit nicely into this bucket. And again, I think a place that most boards do really well in, because this is what we sort of been brought up to understand the work of the board to be, is fiduciary governance. And it does, we do this well. So this is taking care of the assets, overseeing audits, budgets, risk management, executive performance. Great, just talk about that. In this mind, the roles are really clearly defined. Boards govern, staff execute, clear definition. We've done that really well. I think we've done it to death. It's necessary. It's necessary, and this governance fiduciary role is really necessary. It's not going anywhere. Don't throw it out. It's the foundation. It's the regulatory stuff. It's the compliance stuff. Really need to have it. But it can limit the engagement of the board. It maybe is not everything for a board to say, I don't want to talk about line 42 of the financial statements every board meeting. Maybe there's something more for me to do. So if we only stay in that mode, we limit what the board can do and probably limit the organization can do. Strong organizations need a strong board and a strong staff and all those kind of good things. So how do we stretch and grow and give ourselves some different ways to work? So the second mode of governance is strategic, focusing on creating strategic partnerships with management regarding the future of the organization. So sometimes this does happen. It certainly does happen quite often. I think boards are pretty good at this, especially when you go through strategic planning processes. We do a lot of this as Integral Org, probably half a dozen boards right now and staff teams to engage the board in where we go in the next 1 to 3 to 5 years, depending how long your planning framework is. So how do we do that? How do we sort of figure out not the day-to-day, but what are the next steps, the next sort of midterm steps that we need to take? And boards, I think, are okay at this kind of stuff. We do tend to engage, at least during those planning processes, this kind of question. It probably a little more front and center in our ongoing work, but how do we bring that forward? So it deepens the engagement of the board to matters of how we're going to enact, how we're going to get to our mission and vision. What's the lanes we take there? There's never one lane. There's never one set of strategies. So it's how do you find the best pathways to enact and to fulfill your mission and vision? In the terms of how boards engage with strategy, this is on concepts, the overall directions, not the details. Now that's starting to move into management to implement the plan, but boards have a very important voice in setting those strategic pieces or being a part of setting those strategic directions. In this case, it's a partnership. So how to figure out how we work. This is a co-created one generally, not always, but I think for a lot of boards, this is co-created. So that partnership with the CEO and the staff on that, it does involve a higher level of communication and information from both internal and external sources to understand the issues. It's hard for boards to set strategic directions if you don't really know what's going on. So we use a construct in integral org of sort of the current state, what's happening internally, what's happening externally, a bit of visioning kind of stuff. You need all that, but boards need information to do that kind of work to make sure that the decisions they're making aren't just kind of good ideas or maybe not good ideas, who knows, they get thrown in the mix. So how do you make sure that boards are informed enough to make decisions? We need that partnership, that flow of information, that communication that is really, really important. The last piece, and gets a little more abstract, and this is, I think, one of the more interesting pieces for boards is the idea of generative governance. And that's focusing on sense making for the future of the organization, exploring new directions. So maybe beyond the 1 to 3 or 5 year horizon, this gets into sort of, I think, sort of existential questions sometimes. It gets into, 10 years out, are we still going to be around? Do we need to think about a merger that we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves down the road? What's the best way to get to where we want to go? So you're not dealing with sort of the here and now and the sort of more sort of the fiduciary side of things. It is dealing with bigger questions. And this is, when we talk about scenario planning, sometimes boards would do scenario planning. We've done a bit of that with organizations where you're trying to figure out what if. You're not trying to predict the future because you don't know what's coming up, but you're trying to say, where are we going to go in the longer term? And scenario planning is one tool. We did a session with folks who were involved in natural gas and co-ops of natural gas. For that organization, and you start to think, well, 10 years out, are we still around? What's the role of fossil fuels? Do we need to be, will we be an organization? Those are really important questions. They don't tend to factor into day-to-day and the fiduciary stuff right now. They may not even be part of your strategies. Some of those questions may feed back that way, but they are questions you should ask as a board. And that sort of lifts your horizon from today to the longer term future. So this is, you come in sense maker. You're not trying to predict things. You're not planning. You're not doing this role. And that's awkward for some, because if you kind of person who wants to get things done and be really concrete, generative work is a little more abstract, can be a little more frustrating, but it's really important. So I think there are questions where every board needs to think through these things, and it's a bit of a muscle you need to exercise every now and then. And if you haven't exercised that muscle when you're called upon to do it, it doesn't necessarily perform quite as well. So that idea of being sense maker, thinking about the future, it's inclusive, it's creative, thought-provoking. You're trying to find questions and sort of dream a bit about stuff and allow insights to emerge. So again, not necessarily practical, that can be challenging. It's probably not something you're spending all your time on a board meeting on, but again, not a bad exercise. This needs to take time to sort of create some room for dialogue, for knowledge, for information. There's no right or wrong answers in this. This mode is a bit challenging sometimes for staff, and maybe even for founders or organizations and boards where you have people on for a long time, because you're kind of questioning the status quo a bit. And for staff, if we've been mandated to sort of execute and make things happen, to have people think about, well, maybe we shouldn't be here. Maybe that whole way of being or running our work is not the way to go. So you need some trust in this, you need some time, you need some information, you need to set the context to do this well. Boards this is an important role. The generative government is, because boards do have a few things that really feed this really well. You have the power, you're the responsible for the organization. So where it's going today and tomorrow, it's up to you. There's plurality, and this is the power, the strongest part of boards, I think, is the plurality. You get voices around the table that, yeah, you have a somewhat common vision or passion for the organization, but all kinds of different experiences, backgrounds, personality styles, all that kind of stuff. That plurality, if harnessed and used in the right way, is super, super important and really powerful. And the position, you're a top and outside. You're not caught up in the day-to-day. You're not having to go, do all the work of the organization, in that sense that you have that position of both a top and outside the organization, which gives you a perspective of the organization that is somewhat unique. So interesting stuff. I think it's an interesting book. It comes from Governance and Leadership by Chait, Ryan, and Taylor. There you go. A little thing came up. Well, it's actually 17 years old, 18 years old. There we go. So that's one thought. So building upon that, as we move through that fiduciary, kind of that governance 101, which is 20, 30 years old, the roots of a lot of that stuff. Governance and leadership in the last, couple decades anyway. And this is a new piece I want to throw on the table here, because I think it's quite interesting. It's one of the better pieces on board governance that I have seen in the last couple of years. And this is again from Stanford Social Innovation. and it's Principles of Governance, the Purpose-Driven Boards. It's an article that came out, I think, a couple of years ago now. And that opening quote about boards being a unique and curious leadership structure comes from this article. And I like how they sort of take a fresh look at boards, and they don't dismiss the work of boards. Again, it's building. It's a way of conceptualizing how we get the best out of a board. And so they did a survey that sort of drew some of their attention to this world, and that boards are preoccupied with fundraising above all else. Not every board is preoccupied with fundraising necessarily, but finances tend to dominate a lot of our talk. Finances and programming be the two big ones. That sometimes boards are disconnected from the communities and the people they serve. Again, that's being a top and outside the organization. Sometimes that gives a great perspective, and sometimes you're quite a ways away from the people that you are supposedly serving. So how do we, find ways to maybe lessen that gulf or make some better connections? Ill-informed about the ecosystems within what their organizations are working through. Again, is how do we know how to make decisions if we're not connected? And lacking in racial and ethnic diversity. So kind of calling a bit of a, just saying, okay, we haven't quite nailed it in the model we've been using for years. Are there better ways of doing things? And they don't come up with a model necessarily. They're not trying to say, well, here's a prescriptive list, but they come up with some ideas that I think, help with that. And so what tends to happen is, and their model is that, or their thought is anyway, that the board gets sidelined in strategic decisions, leaving the organization vulnerable. The CEO leaves, and you've been saying, hey, we got a great CEO. We don't have to be involved in this stuff. They know what they're doing. They report back. We're on top. We see things. CEO leaves, and all of a sudden you're sitting there as a group that's responsible for the organization, and you've got no legs to make it happen. So there is that. Or you get boards that are decisions that are ill-informed by a board. So how do you make those decisions if you're not connected to the people in the organization without getting to day-to-day management stuff? And that's the tension. That's the challenge, I think, that underlies a lot of board work. So they have 4 different principles, and they are principles, and they're thought things. They have to be worked through in terms of organization. But I quite like them. They're quite interesting, I find. The first is prioritizing the organization's purpose rather than the organization itself. So we're here to get something done in community. We're here to make a change for people or for a community. We're not necessarily here to keep the organization going. And those are different things. Yes, the organization might be the best means to achieve our purpose, but not necessarily over time. We talk about generative governance, those big questions, that feeds into that. And I think a lot of times boards get sort of bought into the idea that my job here is to keep the organization going. Yes, it is. In one sense. In another sense, it is your job is here to ensure the purpose, the thing you're set out to do, is enacted. The organization becomes a means to an end. Easy to say, hard to do. A lot of organizations can say, yeah, we'd love to work ourselves. We would love to put ourselves out of work. Well, we don't get to 30,000 nonprofits in Alberta with everybody putting themselves out of work. So the idea of keeping an organization going tends to dominate our agenda sometimes. And the idea of purpose tends to go into the back seat or get assumed, perhaps, not the back seat. Respect for the ecosystem, acknowledging that the organization's actions impact the surrounding ecosystem. As you get bigger, maybe a little more easy to see this, small organizations to say, but that the work we do is to address something in community, to address something in society that we think needs to be better, whether that's arts or homelessness or mental health, whatever it is, there are sports. We're trying to do things. And well intended, usually well executed, but sometimes we're not benign in the system. The interventions we take within the system change that system. As funders, you see that quite often. They're not just here to support certain things. They can direct the way the system works. You see some funders moving toward things like diversity and equity and inclusion. Fantastic, under-resourced for a long time. That changes the system you're within. So we recognize that the actions we take in terms of the system of nonprofits, we change that system. Equity mindset, avoiding advancing equitable outcomes. I think we're early days in this, lots of great stuff in the last few years. We're not there yet. Governance, I think, is still lacking in this area. Representation on boards, governance policies, the ways we work tend to be, governance itself is a fairly colonial kind of model, very hierarchical. So I think we're starting to see the early days of changing some of the systems of governance, but we're a long way away from that kind of work. And the authorized power and voice, that we can talk about legal power and the act giving you power. Absolutely it does. That's the way the law is a land. But really, when you talk about where power comes from, it comes from those you serve. And how do you make sure that what you're doing is endorsed, not just endorsed, but that you're doing something that meets their needs in a really powerful and fulsome kind of way. So different stuff. Again, so Stanford Social Innovation, a nice article to read. It's 4 or 5 pages. I think we can link to it here at the end, but it's a great one for a thought leadership. And if you like a little tool for your board, just a thought piece for the board saying, hey, here's some stuff we need to think about, that generative governance stuff, that taking care of the board's self-governance role. This is a nice one to sort of throw out there as a bit of a reading material. So some places to go for board governance resources, Imagine Canada Standards. It's an accreditation program. You don't have to go through your accreditation and pay the money. You can get the materials in the handbook to talk about what you need to do to sort of tune your organization in a number of different ways, governance being one, nicely broken down in different sides of organizations. So I quite like the standards program. The board development program, really good here in Alberta. Resources, tools, some workshops, some of that stuff, but it's great because it's Alberta-based stuff. And sometimes you can get resources from other parts of the country or around the world. You got to make sure it fits with your experience. The basics in terms of governance are roughly the same. Sometimes the legislative stuff has a bit of a different nuance. Again, the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, all kinds of great stuff there. Open access, just search their nonprofit library. Board Source is an American group. So again, take that caveat of making sure you're not doing things that aren't necessarily Canadian context appropriate. But in terms of board culture or structuring meetings or doing some of those technical things, a nice source of information, lots of material there as well.
Maybe I'll let people put those in the chat, but I notice a lot of people typically after these sessions, they are thinking of updating their policies. And, I know you mentioned that board structures change over time and the organization matures, but are there any typical triggers that we would look out for that would tell us that we need to update our policies, or, particular key policies that often need updating in your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you've got some sort of structure, a policy on policy making. Sometimes we'll call it saying, we will review our policy every 2 years or something like that. So there is something you've developed as a policy, which because we haven't got it, because you need the guidelines, but you've set some expectations, some structure to do that. So that's one trigger, perhaps. Sometimes external things. I mean, you saw that probably a lot during COVID. People had to adjust board policies. You saw it on bylaws. You couldn't have annual meetings. So there's things that adjust because external environments shift sometimes. So sometimes they'll trigger things, sometimes global like that, sometimes more related to an individual nonprofit. So that may be a trigger saying, boy, we don't have a CEO anymore. We got a whole bunch of policies on CEO and delegation. Maybe that's it. That's part of it. Sometimes it's things that change in community. So diversity and equity inclusion, a big one, where we've written policy manuals without taking those lenses or those language and that stuff into consideration. That might be another driver. So there's no one way into it. I think the best practice would be the policy on policy making, which gives you some guidance on when to review things, but there may be more external as well. Yeah.
And I guess from your wisdom, are there any processes or anything that kind of makes this a manageable process, or are there really common policy mistakes or in terms of
I think it's making sure that you're not, one of the things that people tend is they tend to have policies that sometimes you get in nonprofits, people borrowing their policies and changing a name or a language to their own. I get that's easy, and it's probably because writing policies is not fun for most people. But it's hard because sometimes you find something that's not really yours. So that would be a pretty common mistake, to say that policy manuals, I don't think anybody starts from scratch ever. They all tend to look kind of the same. There's a pretty basic number of sections of policies. But if you're doing that, make sure it's really yours. Aside from the proprietary stuff that, are you stealing somebody else's material? You can't just assume that what works for the organization or works for the board you've been on is going to work for this organization. So there's a bit of a personalizing of that too, that I think is really important. And that's why I think the regular review is, so you're not doing it all at once. It's not overwhelming. It's not, you're adding policy after policy after policy. They're going back and saying, maybe we can let go of some so they can get kind of quite unwieldy. And if you end up with a 500-page policy manual, it's probably not very helpful. So it's being on top of it. And it goes back to that board governance piece, self-governance, saying we got to tend to our own work. And part of our own work is our own policies. So you don't focus on every day, but you don't let it get out of hand. And you don't just sort of assume it works for other people, work for you as well.
Great. Yeah. And for the next slide, there's some examples of services that we've done in board development. So these can range, as Mike said, to strategic planning, but we have also done development workshops for the boards, and even in-depth evaluations of governance policies. So every organization's context is different. So of course, maybe you want to start by giving us a quick call, if you go to the next slide, just to see what we can do for you. So we, our mission is to support all Alberta nonprofits in fulfilling their missions. So if you want some sort of we're open to answering and guiding you to the best of our abilities. So if you have a quick question or you like a deeper 1 hour problem solving session, we provide these for free. We connect you with experts like Mike. And you can find out more by visiting our website or contacting our main number. We don't have any other questions in the chat, so I suppose we'll just wrap up there with respecting everyone's time. Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining today, and please do check out our webinar and our evaluation survey. And I don't have anything else to add, Mike.
I've said a lot. I've got enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything I possibly could have to say, I've said. So
Okay.
there we go.
All right. Thank
Well,
you, everyone.
thank you, folks. Take care, and we hope to see you next time.